Trump and Brexit, and now the COVID situation, all of it has broken the back of neoliberalism, and yet capitalist realism remains.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Inside Critical Theory brings you this Diet Soap interview. All right, Mike Watson is an author for Zero Books. He's a longtime curator of art. What was your job in the world of fine art, Mike?
Well, yeah, I was a curator, freelance, and a critic. So I wrote for a number of international magazines as a critic, and I managed exhibitions. So basically, like organized, planned exhibitions.
Right. Yeah. And you're the author of Can the Left Learn to Meme and The Meming of Mark Fisher.
That's right, yeah.
Which were both either published by or scheduled to be published by Zero Books. Although The Meming of Mark Fisher, both of them were published by Zero Books when I worked there. And then you had another book that was actually, I think, put under contract by the previous team, although perhaps that's not correct. But I remember early days I worked on a book called, what was it called again? That's suddenly slipping my mind.
Called Towards the Conceptual Militancy.
Right.
Yeah, it seems a really long time ago now. It was actually 2016 it came out, but it was signed for under the original Zero Books. And then mysteriously, a lot of their contracts just kind of disappeared because they put out 20-year contracts on books in the very beginning. And I think John Hunt got fed up with that, and he basically just told the original incarnation of Zero to cancel a lot of contracts. So that's when you came in and you told me, yeah, your contract's been cancelled, we can't really find it. And anyway, we reissued the contract under you.
Right. Okay. Right. What had happened was it had been long enough since the book, the contract was originally offered and the book was being turned in. What I was told, not what necessarily what really happened, but what I was told was, well, there are many authors from the old team that signed contracts but never delivered manuscripts, and we're tired of waiting on them. And it's been years.
It was a long
we're
time.
Canceling them.
Yeah, but I spoke to somebody from the original team, and I don't want to say who or exactly what was said, but anyway, they said a similar thing, but they said that it shouldn't have happened. They didn't agree with that. Before you came in, it was before you came in that lots of people's contracts kind of disappeared because they gave us really like crazy deadlines on them. Really, it was 20 years I had, but they wanted it in a couple of years. I know I went way over that.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, the contracts now say you have like a couple of years. Yeah, something like that. And you know, we don't play hard and fast with that contract. You know, like I had a contract with Zero Books that I never fulfilled. And because I was the publishing manager, I just figured, well, anytime I wanted to, I could turn that book in and get it published. But I guess no longer. That is not the case any longer. I doubt I will be publishing with Zero Books.
Yeah, I have no idea what the new team are doing. There's nothing to say they'll behave like the original team. And apparently that what happened to me was more of an issue of John Hunt. But yeah, I mean, people are worried.
Well, I mean, that was not just happening to you, by the way. That was happening to a whole ton of authors who hadn't turned in books yet. And my feeling had been at the time that those books were just never going to come, for the most part. And the only person that I recall who said, hey, I don't want to have my contract canceled was you. And my attitude was at that time, anyone who stepped forward and said, no, I have a book, would be welcome to turn in their book.
Yeah, I decided to write it like years after I signed for it. And actually David Blacker, who's a mutual friend who also recommended you to Zero originally, he told me, hey, why don't you just get on and finish that book? And I did. As you were coming in, I was finishing it, or a first draft of it that we reworked.
So I would say, if I remember, I'm sorry, I forgot towards the conceptual militancy. Um, as was the name of your first book. It just it somehow, I'm getting old. I'm forgetting words. I'm feeling like maybe I
Yeah,
need to
but I think
take
it's
some.
that classic first book thing, at least for the author, that being me in this case. I don't even remember I wrote it. Unless you happen to write a brilliant first book, and you're never going to forget it. I don't think it's a bad book, but I often don't remember that as among my books.
Right. All right. So then you and I are on the same page, but also, we're maybe both getting to be older. Um, so the thing that I wanted to mention though is I recall there being sort of a conceptual thread that went from towards conceptual militancy through can the left learn to meme through to the memeing of Mark Fisher, and it has to do with how artistic practices and creative expression can create an opening in the contemporary ideological world, the superstructure of society, for more radical activity. If we can, basically, we can start to have a more open, challenging um, uh, artistic practice and art world, that could facilitate the development of a working class struggle and working class consciousness around socialism. Is that correct?
For sure, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, basically that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I
And
think I was more. Yeah, the first book was leaning more towards anarchism, but it's basically the same premise that creativity somehow should play a role in any revolutionary movement.
I of course don't disagree with you at all. And you came to Adorno. Um, um, was Adorno a major figure in towards the conceptual militancy? Remind me.
He certainly came into it. I don't think it was major when he used to Adorno, because I ended up more talking about Duchamp and Beuys, who are actually artists, conceptual artists.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was some kind of Adorno. I kind of modified Adorno through Duchamp and Beuys, but I think, yeah, certainly Duchamp and Beuys were more important at that point.
Yeah, and by Duchamp and Beuys, I feel are very different artists. I mean, you would see very little commonality between their works if you just experience them in a gallery. I think, especially at the time that Boyce was producing, say. But
Yeah,
you think that, but probably the error there is to be looking at the surface or the materiality of their works
yeah,
rather than the concepts behind them. What would you say the connection
yeah. Well,
is
they both
between
took
Duchamp and Boyce?
objects, as you know. They both what Duchamp did is he took just objects and called them art. That's what you call a ready-made, just for the wider public, because the thing is already made. So rather than producing something using craft skills, you just basically take a thing and say this is art. So Duchamp did this in the early 1900s, most famously with his urinal, which is called Fountain. So this is a urinal from a man's restroom. I think that was 1917. And Beuys, well, he did a number of things, but he did do that as well. He took things and called them art, but they were different aesthetically. Duchamp tended to go with very kind of clean, minimal things, and Beuys used to group things together, and they tended to be more rustic looking. And he played a lot on felt, things like felt, and it's all had some kind of relation to his backstory, because he apparently came down in World War One. I think it was one fighter plane, and would that have been two then? Okay, World War II fighter plane, and got taken in by basically peasants who covered in fat and felt to keep him safe. So he kept using fat and felt in his works, but the fat also related to certain kind of shamanic properties, and he used beeswax a lot as well, because that relates to shamanism, and also is a symbol of socialism, because bees are a symbol of socialism. So the things they used were different, but the main difference was that Duchamp basically did this thing where he took objects and called them art, and he was the first person to do it. And the thing there is, you're basically saying you no longer need the kind of academics, so should we say, but more, should we say, craft skills, the technical skills of an artist to make art. But what Duchamp said is you still had to be an artist. You couldn't just be anyone and pick a thing and call it art. And what Beuys did is he had this saying, we are all artists. So basically what he did is he threw down a challenge to Duchamp, you know, why not just say everyone's an artist and anyone can declare anything as art? And they actually kind of disagreed. And then Beuys famously said, the silence of Marcel Duchamp is overrated, because he felt that Duchamp should have been more political in his kind of statement. That was a real conflict. But I kind of said, well, you put the two together, put Duchamp's anything can be art with Beuys's we're all artists, and you get this thing where we can all go around declaring anything as art, you know, at any point. And so we can declare politics as art. So you know, who's to say that you have to declare objects as art? Why can't you declare situations as art? And the thing that does, if you think about how art relates to politics, normally it's thought to be the more frivolous of the two, because in art you're expected just to basically invent stuff with no kind of, you know, notion of the consequences. Whereas politics, you kind of have to think about the consequences. And that's often the kind of sticking point or the blockage. You're dealing with the real world, so you're dealing with a number of impediments. So if you kind of take politics and call it art, you open up a space for experimentation. And you see this going on actually in art spaces today. Since the economic crisis of 2007, 2008, you see a lot more political art than we've been seeing for decades. And you see lots of kind of workshops in art spaces dedicated to rethinking, at least, you know, through speaking, you know, as groups in seminars or through literal kind of, you know, workshops. I rethink.
Can I want to voice an objection to this idea of taking politics and calling it art. And here's my objection, to see if you can, see if you can overcome this objection. What I've noticed in the realm of art, and it was more maybe 5 or 6 years ago, is that rather than transforming real politics into art, what you have is art that poses as politics, and politics as it's conventionally known. So an example would be you'd have an activist lawyer working on helping renters, stay in their homes or achieve rent control, and this would be documented. And the struggles will be documented in various forms and photographs, and then it would be presented in a gallery. And this is just an example. I mean, I'm not pointing to a literal example, but it's sort of a hybrid of real examples. And what I think about that is that it is a way to valorize a certain kind of activist politics, progressive politics, and that's all. It does not open up the realm of politics for experimentation, but rather closes down the moral principles and the kinds of thinking that can happen in a gallery.
Yeah, that's totally right. Yeah, I think that is discussed in the book somewhere. Certainly, yeah, I would have talked about something like that. Basically, the way that art is used to, if I get what you're saying correctly, that you basically, you posture as doing politics, but you're not really doing it, and that looks good. So
you are doing politics. You're doing something that's like politics. It's activist politics that has an effect on individuals. I mean, like after Occupy ended, one of the things that happened was that the protesters who were trying to occupy public spaces turned and they tried to help people who are being evicted stay in their homes. And what that turned the politics into was a politics of basically coping with the world as it was, rather than aiming at transforming it. There were already institutions in place that could help people who are facing evictions. The protesters worked with, maybe a little bit outside the law, but they did things with largely with the understanding of the legal system, in place as well. And um, there was no aim to transform the background, just to deal with the consequences of the system as it was. And I would say the same thing's true with the kind of activism I described. It was, someone who's doing good work as a progressive activist, or you might also just take like a public defender who is working to protect the poorest amongst us from criminal prosecution, and document their work and then put it on display in the gallery. It's not like their work is not valuable. It's just that doesn't amount to art. It valorizes what is, I think, too much. But anyway, I'll let you talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different things going on. I don't know, the first time you were going through the problem of art and politics, I thought you said something about galleries as well. So there's two different things going on, whether you did or whether you didn't. There's people who make, art about politics, so they could paint a, depiction of people suffering through war, like Picasso's Guernica, and that's something that's different from an activist using art. Like if an activist makes a banner.
Oh, right, yeah. I'm not talking about
different things, but certainly in the art world, I think there's a tendency to talk about politics because, it kind of looks good, and collectors like it. Collectors like to buy stuff that has a political value because it whitewashes their own activity. Because people who have enough money to buy art are often involved in things like buying and selling houses or other investments, so there is a kind of middle class guilt, but also I think one gets to talk about political subjects without really doing very much. So it's a bit like academia, where people talk about Marx and they go as far as talking about Marx, and the whole thing about Marx's complexity and the amount of works he has, and then all the kind of people branching off from Marx means you can discuss that forever without actually proposing any solutions, or at least not going into the street, so to speak. So you have this whole issue, but then you have art and activism, and maybe people using art in protests, and I think that could be powerful. But that's where people might say, well, that's where it's no longer art, because actually if you look into the history of art and modernist philosophy, the idea with art, as with beauty in the Kantian sense, is that it's it's kind of without a purpose. Kant actually said that beauty is purposiveness without a purpose. It gets a bit more complicated, but the point is it doesn't have a purpose in the kind of capitalist sense or rationalist scientific sense. And that being without a purpose gives it a kind of critical distance, where you don't have to get involved in the nitty-gritty of political debate or philosophical debate, where you're constantly meeting oppositions. You can kind of think a lot more freely, or emote or whatever more freely. And when you take that into the political realm, you lose that distance, which allows for play, allows for free play, and it's no longer really art in that sense. So you have this frustrating kind of opposition, where the critical distance of art will never actually be made useful, and the kind of usefulness of politics leads it to constantly meet with challenges.
So do you think memes are someone's texting me. Do you think that memes are useful?
Yeah, well, I think that the problem is that the art world is just not very useful, and you had this massive explosion in political art since the crisis, and I think that's natural because people were starting to question things. But I think again, there's this middle class guilt. So you had a massive explosion in Europe of art around immigration and art around particularly migrants coming across the
but memes. I asked if are memes useful?
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that that this is a safe space to do politics when you're not really doing it, and actually the art space is very bourgeois, and the whole thing it's a space in which anyone can express themselves, this being the kind of impetus behind government policy making, often in the arts, is that we need an art for all. This thing, it doesn't really exist. Firstly, the politics is not effective. It's not actually politics when it's in the gallery. It has this distance. And secondly, it's not really horizontal, as in, for everyone. Whereas the internet space is much more for everyone, which is what I was coming to. So I think memes, by comparison to the art world, is more effective politically, at least in the sense that everyone can express themselves. And I think we can't doubt now, many people. I mean, who can't express themselves through memes? I mean, people who don't want to, people who are perhaps unable for some reason, physically to make memes. But most people in most countries can make memes now, I guess, and put them out. So this is something really powerful. But there's obviously there are huge impediments in terms of.
My understanding of the idea of open thinking and the use of useless art to create a space for critical engagement would be that you would want to admit that the work doesn't have any immediate or imminent practical purpose. And so that because it doesn't fit within society as it is, you have the potential or the chance for a new notion to emerge. There would be something other than society as it is that would be motivating the production of the art. Maybe that's what's meant by like art for art's sake, is that you have art that isn't engaging directly in society as it is, but is engaging with some formal innovation or some conceptual difficulty, which does not have to be immediately political in order to have aesthetic or artistic value.
For sure, yeah, and this is where Adorno would say that actually it's the art for art's sake. I don't think he uses that term very much, but abstract art that doesn't depict anything that's more valuable, that's actually more political, because it's in contradiction, because it's not political. So his issue is that post World War II, drawing depictions of suffering, famously in Auschwitz, and actually he was referencing poetry, but depictions of suffering in the Holocaust are actually going to play back into that suffering. And it's because so if you depict something and you're just basically showing it again, so obviously you're as he said in his essay on commitment of 1962, you're kind of enabling people to elicit joy from suffering a second time. But it was actually more because Adorno's whole issue is that humans think through a process of what he calls identification, which means you start to label and number and categorize things as a means of navigating the world and as a means of surviving the threat of nature. And for him, figurative art is a form of identification. So for him, the horror of World War II arose out of too much identification, too many nationalizations and basically a numerical count applied to all people. So the process of identification taken to its nth degree results in us all having an identity as a number value. So we all have a wage or none, and then we're worth nothing. And Adorno basically says, okay, so the end result of that is, for example, the Jews who were killed in the gas chamber effectively having a value of sorts, and there's also the identification of them just being Jews, which is, in any case, obviously a problem. But there's an economic rationality as well to the war and perhaps to the Holocaust. So he says, well, you can't counter identification with more identification. So only an abstract art can really break through that. So an abstract art is one in which you don't know what you're looking at, or for him, more listening to, because he was more into music than visual art. So in not knowing, you end up floating and you end up unable to grasp onto things and give them numbers and give them names, etc.
So do memes work through identification?
Well, that's the thing. They often do, especially this kind of Wojak culture, this end of memeing, where you're depicting types of people for giggles. I don't think that really offers us very much. I think maybe the sum total of all memes can be disorienting, and then that might lead you to think in new ways because you can't really grasp onto anything because there's so much happening on the net. But overall, I'm yet to see much that one could call an abstract meme, really. I mean, I think there are abstract type YouTube productions that have become very popular, like Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, this puppet show.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
Which is abstract. You know, of course, people can say, well, it's not abstract because it has figures like humanoid type figures in it, although I think like they're birds and things, but this kind of anthropomorphic type figures, things you can identify. But Adorno was a strong supporter of Beckett. He really loved Samuel Beckett and Kafka, and they actually have things, like Kafka's man that turns into some kind of beast or beetle in Metamorphosis. But the thing is that they're weird. These stories produce moments where you're not quite sure what's going on, and they're moments of shock. So this for Adorno is an abstraction. So I think we could say Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared is an abstract artwork. So those kind of things. But I think they tend to need to be of duration. It's hard to make an abstract meme when it's something you look at for probably a second.
Right. I mean, it seems to me that a meme requires you to be ensconced or immersed in kind of internet culture so thoroughly that what might to an outsider be relatively obscure or completely opaque is immediately understandable and recognizable and meaningful and humorous in an instant. That's how a meme works, I think. And you don't have to catch every reference in a meme for it to work, but it helps. The full effect. It helps to know the history of the meme, to kind of be aware of how it developed and to really appreciate a new variation on a meme, for instance. So that brings me to the memeing of Mark Fisher. It seems to me that book is decrying the memeing of Mark Fisher, is concerned about the reduction of Mark Fisher to a mere meme. Am I correct about that?
For sure, yeah, to a large degree. I mean, I found it kind of a bit disturbing when I first saw Fisher memes and just the kind of things that were coming up in Fisher forums. Like there's a Facebook one called Mark Fisher Memes for Hauntological Teens. The flippancy you see on some of these forums, but I'm always in conflict because I think it's a really good thing that the internet allows many more people to get into culture and philosophy than otherwise could. So there are these two kind of things running up against each other that anyone can kind of grasp onto to theorists, but that maybe they don't understand them very well. So,
I mean, as far as advertising goes, memes might not be the worst thing, and to get someone who maybe never had heard of Mark Fisher to be interested in his work because he encounters this meme page, knows the original memes and kind of sees the variations on them. But it doesn't seem to me to be the kind of art that opens up thinking. And it's not and if you never get past the level of Mark Fisher, the meme, you're going to be in real trouble. I remember back in 2000, what's going on with my, see, oh, okay. I remember back in 2011 or 12, during Occupy, I was involved in a Marxist organization, and there was real concern about the memeing of Marx, the reduction of Marx to a mere image, the rejection of Marx's actual writings and theories for Marx as a brand. You can say the same thing about Che Guevara, or you can say the same thing about Huey Newton, or any number of leftist icons who've been reduced to just being an image, recuperated. And the memeing of Mark Fisher is just kind of an internet version of process of recuperation, right?
For sure, yeah. And I think also a continuation or some kind of development of what was already happening in terms of theory online. You had these websites in the late 90s around theory. Wasn't one called C Theory? I mean, they were great at popularizing theory and used to get people actually commissioned essays. I'm not sure if they were paid or not. You would get new essays appear on them on these websites. They were very simple. And then from that, you got a period of theory blogging. So not just websites where you had kind of depositories of old and new theory essays, which made it easier to access these things, but people keeping their own blogs where they would write their own theory. So you got Fisher, I think from 2003, keeping his blog K-Punk. And there was a kind of explosion in theory blogging. But it wasn't that big. I say explosion, but it was tiny compared to the kind of theory memeing community today. And yeah, I think the left tube, red tube, whatever you want to call it, or perhaps these are different tendencies, and left book and left memeing are kind of a development of this. And I think they're positive in a sense, because whilst the blogging community enabled a situation where you could easily talk to Mark Fisher, he had comments until he closed the comment sections on his blog, which a number of people did because it got really nasty. But there were comments, but also you could find the emails of these people. I used to speak to Fisher, and Graham Harman was another philosopher who kept a blog, who still does actually. But there was this kind of closing the distance between the public and known theorists, which was really important, because back then I was studying a master's around 2003 to 2005. And I know I couldn't really access my tutors very easily. They were still this thing of like your professor being someone who came in like just before the lessons started and then just ran away at the end and said like, you can email me, I'll respond in these hours. And there's one exception, Ray Brassier, who's quite a well-known figure. He was actually quite generous with his time, but generally it was a bit like that. And I mean, he was one of the tutors where I was doing my master's. But on the whole, you know, you couldn't reach these people, but you could reach Mark Fisher and Graham Harman. Fisher, I think at the point around then was teaching at colleges. I think it would be high school in America. Mm-hmm. Harman was teaching in American University of Cairo. So they were professors, but they were someone else's professors, but they would also talk to you. You know, I don't know if they spoke to their own students. I guess so, but it opened things up a lot. But it was still a fairly small community, and there was still a lot of a kind of snobbery there. You know, it wasn't as open as it is now. You still felt also that these are like the not really gatekeepers, but they were the guys at the top, the ones running those blogs. They still had this kind of celebrity status. I think memeing trashes that completely, because I've been in forums and it's like people just taking the piss out of me, whether they know who I am or not, you know. And it's quite, it's quite a strong sensation when it happens. I'm sure, I know you've had it happen as well. So there isn't the thing of, well, hey, it's Doug Lane, listen to him, because obviously evidently you know stuff from when you're smart and whatever, and you communicate well. There's sometimes it's Doug Lane, let's pile on him, or it's Mike Watson, let's pile on him. I think actually the more that happens, the more I'm kind of happy that people know what I do. But there's no such thing as, well, hey, look, listen, 1 minute I wrote this and this book. It just doesn't wash anymore. And of course that in a sense is positive, but in a sense is negative as well. But it's a process that began with this theory blogging, and it's continuing. And then I think you have to go, well, can you really then turn around and say, these kids are just talking shit or whatever, they're kind of rude and nasty, when we actually want a situation where everyone can say whatever they want in many ways, or otherwise, what is it we want?
Yeah, I agree with that. I remember when I was first podcasting, I was amazed at how accessible professors were, or writers as well. Like, for the most part, with some rare exceptions, if I wanted to have someone on my podcast, I just had to know about them. And if I did know about them, I could, reach out to them and have them on, especially if they were academics. There were some exceptions. There were, academics who were actually relatively famous. So, for instance, David Harvey never responded, and still hasn't. I should try again. Maybe I could get him now. Zizek took years for me to get on the podcast, but for the most part, like, Jody Dean, certainly Mark Fisher, anyone whose work I was aware of, whether it was work online or books, I could generally bring on, especially professors and academics who were selling books in the hundreds, and we're always glad to have an opportunity to talk about what they had done. I think that podcasting and digital media has definitely opened up and interconnected people. It's opened up the realm of publishing and critical thinking and critical theory, and made it much easier to reach out to people. But with someone like Mark Fisher, now that he's gone, and he's been gone since 2017, there's something else going on with him, like with Mark, like with Karl Marx or Guy Debord or Adorno, even, where rather than a living thinker who's engaged in trying to understand the world and work out theoretical understanding, you have someone whose work is now done and frozen, and who, more importantly, whose image is fixed, and or at least that image actually may be transformed, but that whose image is as branded into the world as well. So, like, Mark Fisher is probably more famous now after his death than he was even in 2016, and his work was hardly finished when he left. He was not like he had developed an idea that had already transformed the world when he died. He was still definitely developing his ideas, and a lot of people end up just developing ideas until the end of their life and never quite reach it. I think it's a noble effort to do that, but what I found is that Mark Fisher has become sort of a stand-in, like Karl Marx, for just being against capitalism, just sort of being a leftist. He's just sort of like a universal signifier for being a leftist. There's nothing particular about Mark Fisher beyond. Mark Fisher, capitalist realism. That's as far as you need to go in understanding him. And I feel like that's the way in which he was reduced to a meme. And it's not that the people who are doing that have bad intentions. It's just that somehow happens to thinkers and to artists, after their death or sometimes before. So,
well, I think so for sure. Yeah, I think with Fisher, unfortunately, it's not just this thing of him saying that capitalism's bad and perhaps there isn't an alternative, and hopefully there is one, but probably not. It's not just that; it's that capitalism causes depression, and there's no alternative, and that's really damaging, because that's not really what he said. He kind of says that, but he says, well, maybe there is some kind of glimmer of hope. He says that we need to kind of, I don't remember the exact term, I'm paraphrasing, but there's a suggestion that we need to weaponize depression right at the end of capitalist realism, and then that we need to create small fissures, like small cracks in the capitalist system. So the suggestion is, for me, that we need to kind of take our depression, turn it around through creativity, and then open up some cracks in capitalism. So that's really a strong, powerful combination, but that's not what you get in memes. You tend to get capitalism equals depression and there's no way out. So obviously, for a lot of young people getting into Fisher, that's not really good. It seems like it's just an amplification of depression through memes.
Yeah. I think that there are, when you take Fisher seriously and engage with his work, and get into the details. I mean, for instance, I've got Capitalist Realism right here, and I've read it, and all throughout, there are. Let's see. See how I've like marked sections, and these are sections that I mostly disagree with. you know, these are the areas where I have problems. Like here, so here's on page 38. I've written blaming capitalism for mental illness is rather vague. Compare this explanation to Marx's explanation of the effects of factory work. And you'll see the relative poverty of Fisher's explanation.
I suppose it's a very small volume. And when it came out, I mean, of course, people really liked it, but there were people saying that it doesn't really propose or do much. Honestly, I mean, back then people were saying that quite openly, who might not be saying it so much now. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm not prepared to say that right now, but it's a small book that introduces some ideas. I mean, it's brilliantly written. His prose style can't be critiqued, I don't think.
No, I wouldn't, and I'm not. And what you can critique is you can critique anything you want, and your criticism may or may not be valid, right?
Okay, true, yeah. But I just think that I've never heard anyone critique his prose style. That for me is beyond doubt that he writes just very well. So I mean, when I revisit his books now, and have that very question in mind, or rather, it's kind of question we're opening up now. Why is he so big? Is that deserved? Perhaps I can definitely. He writes brilliantly. The way it flows. Capitalist realism, I think it iterates very well some things which have been said since the early to middle of the last century, but for public reading in around 2009. And it was valid for a few years, and now it's still valid, but I think it kind of became valid in a new and different way because he's become a meme, but also because of Trump and Brexit, etc. And that was just kind of starting when Fisher departed us.
Well, I mean, look, I think that Mark Fisher was absolutely a valuable writer. His work should be read. And I continue to say that even now that I don't work for Zero Books and I'm not being paid to say that. But I would also say that I think Trump and Brexit were refutations completely of Fisher's perspective. Those events should have marginalized the core of his critique, which was that neoliberalism had frozen capitalism in place, and that was what created this sensation of capitalist realism. Capitalist realism, postmodernity, and neoliberalism are all like on a spectrum theoretically in Fisher's work, and Trump and Brexit, and now the COVID situation, all of it has broken the back of neoliberalism, and yet capitalist realism remains.
Yeah. Well, I think that depends for me on whether. Well, yeah, exactly. Capitalism remains. So there is no alternative. When you get an alternative, it poses as kind of a neo-nationalism, but it actually carries on in much the same way as neoliberalism. It was. I think the nationalism was kind of used when the public were becoming dissatisfied with neoliberalism to keep capitalism there. You're just going to change the clothes. So if Fisher's saying there's no alternative, then I think that's still valid. But perhaps what you're saying is more nuanced than that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think he has a definition of capitalism which it doesn't run deep enough, isn't Marxist enough. And I talked to Fisher; he didn't consider himself to be a Marxist, and because of that, he thinks of a return to like the welfare state or a social democratic state with lots of benefits and regulations and control over the market as being a move away from capitalism. And that's why, like, Jeremy Corbyn is sort of the horizon of his political thought, or it could be seen that way anyhow. I'm not sure if that's entirely fair, but the point is that after Trump was elected, this the neoliberalism as a primary threat to working class struggle was discredited, and the idea that a return to a kind of welfare state nationalism would be a step away from what the worst excesses of capitalism was brought into question as well. But the point is that I Fisher had stuck around and continued to work after Trump was elected. If he hadn't been taken out by depression, I'm sure that he would have been capable of continuing to grow and develop his ideas into like Zizek is a great philosopher, but he is very critical of his first book, The Sublime Object of Ideology. And I'm sure Fisher would feel the same way about his book if he was still around. And perhaps he would be also, I'm sure he would be glad to come on. I mean, maybe, who knows? But if not for the weirdness of my relationship with his work, I'm sure he would have been glad to debate me about these topics. And he was a very open thinker and man. But the thing I want to move into now, we're about 45 minutes in, and I'm going to keep you on the stream here, but maybe now we can move into a conversation that will be for patrons, which is about the way in which your book, The Memeing of Mark Fisher, was received, and originally on Twitter by some of the people who are now running Zero Books, and then what has happened to The Memeing of Mark Fisher now that this change has occurred at John Hunt Publishing, Watkins, and Zero Books.